A bustling hall. A packed cafeteria. A lively office.
We depend on there being people in our buildings to not only detect security incidents, but also to enforce certain norm of human behavior.
But what happens when a pandemic sweeps the globe and those buildings suddenly become empty?
You start to pull people out of those roles, and all of a sudden the system collapses quite quickly.
Adam Conway is the emergency management team lead at the University of Alberta, an institution with over 40,000 students in facilities around the world. He says COVID-19 exposed glaring security vulnerabilities that weren't being considered before.
A severe mental health crisis has been one of our top 3 risks.
In part 1 of our discussion, we look at 4 key pillars behind successful crisis management. We also examine the importance of good information and why you should be prepared for more delinquent behavior in the near future. Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones, and welcome to another edition of SitRep. We're now joined by Adam Conway. And Adam, tell us a little more about yourself and how you got involved in the world of security.
Well, I am the emergency management team lead for the University of Alberta. I've been there about 12 years now. Prior to that, I did 5 years with the provincial government with the Alberta Emergency Management Agency. And prior to that, I did about 6 years with the Canadian Red Cross Society in central northern Alberta. And I fell into the profession by accident. I had left university at the end of my bachelor's degree, and I'd been volunteering with the Red Cross, and Y2K was coming, and they needed people to do community presentations. It was a 6-month contract, which I ultimately got, and discovered that I loved the work and loved the field. And I created enough demand for the presentations that they had to keep me on afterwards. And that led to a career of slowly escalating responsibilities until I got to the place where I am now. Emergency management is kind of fun in that it's not a profession the way an engineer is or a doctor is. And so there are a few different paths to a career. And I am one of the few folks who have come into emergency management as a first career with no prior police or fire or military experience.
That's interesting because a lot of the people we speak with come from a military background or a police background. So your perspective on security from that angle must be a little different, especially since I would think the amount of training you received, since obviously you weren't a police officer or in the army or what have you, the type of training you received would have been different.
Yes, and there is excellent habits taught in police and military around documentation and following process. And so I've had to learn those skills organically over the last 2 decades as I've gone through the career path.
So Adam, tell us a little more about your role at the University of Alberta.
Yeah, if you've never had the opportunity to appreciate the scope and breadth of a research university's operations, it can be quite staggering. The University of Alberta operates research facilities on all 7 continents. We have physics laboratory in Antarctica. We have field schools in Italy. We have grad students in Ukraine. We have our 5 main campuses in Alberta. And so my team's job, very simply, is to react to and recover from and prevent any catastrophes that could affect any of our operations. So we coordinate a team that responds. The coordination task involves a lot of training, a lot of document development, a lot of risk assessment, and then a lot of incident detection. Because of the scale of our operation, finding out when we have been affected by something can be a challenge. And so that's one of the day-to-day tasks of my team.
Well, and those challenges, I'm sure, have been amplified by the pandemic. Before we really get into how that's all changed, when I was doing some digging around on the University of Alberta's website, I noticed that the emergency plans there tend to have four elements, if you will: reduction, readiness, response, and recovery. And I think before we get into the discussion of how the pandemic has changed things for you, and especially since you're an institution that spans the globe, tell us a little bit more about the basics of those four pillars we just mentioned and the emergency management process.
Yeah. So we adopted the four pillars model because it's really easy to remember. And most of the members of our team have a minimum of time that they can give us for training or orientation in advance of something. And so we need really good mnemonics to get our team up and running as quickly as possible. So we would love to start with reduction and readiness. Sadly, reduction, though it is the most beneficial investment, you've got to have breathing room to reduce your emergencies. And certainly over the last 5 years, we've been in almost constant response mode. So we start with readiness, which is making sure we've got the people and that they've got the basic information and tools that they need. And that's where we spend the bulk of our time. Then the next thing that happens is response. An emergency occurs. We activate the team. We activate the plans that they follow. They carry those out. And then we move into recovery. And our recovery plan has two real components to it. One is we attempt to recover stronger than we were before to prevent a future crisis. The second thing we do is we try to improve our processes. We always scrutinize our response to make sure that we can respond better. And those things then feed back into reduction and readiness in our framework. That idea has a conceit to it, and that is that you're only going to have one emergency at a time. And currently we're looking at about 3 right now simultaneously. And so we are having to apply our lessons as we go. And COVID was actually the first time where we did that on a formal level. We had an in-action report. We've had after-action reports, but this was an in-action report that advised us on how to adapt our processes and our procedures in the middle of the emergency, which is really valuable.
Talk a little bit more about those 3 emergencies that are taking place. I think obviously one of them has to be COVID-19 and the pandemic. And even though we're winding down, or at the very least, we hope that we're somewhat winding down, I'd be curious to hear about the other 2 concurrent emergencies that the University of Alberta is dealing with.
Yeah, so the next emergency would be an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that is a concern for us. We have the Ukrainian Studies Institute at the University of Alberta, and we have a huge Ukrainian population, of course, in Edmonton. And some of our grad students and researchers are present in Ukraine. And it is the first conflict that we have had to prepare for on that scale. It's not the first conflict that has affected our community, but it's the first one that would be of this scale for us in a very long time. And the third one would be the operational impacts of a labor disruption. The labor environment in Alberta for post-secondaries changed in the last 5 years, and we now have the possibility of having strikes on our campuses. And so we're preparing for those from the operational perspective, making sure the lights stay on or can be turned back on at the end of a strike, making sure that there's no catastrophic effects to buildings, etc. The labor relations and the negotiation piece we leave to other people, but the operational impacts is on our team.
Adam, you mentioned the crises or potential crises that you're monitoring. Normally, and I'm hesitant to use that term, but normally, how would the university go about monitoring the 40,000 plus students across all these campuses and facilities around the world, and how would information be delivered when threats emerge?
We typically would be dependent on the presence of people to detect these things, and in particular, the presence of supervisors, whether they're academic or administrative supervisors. So we would get a call from a coach. The coach would say, we've had a bus accident with our women's hockey team. We need support in the following areas. Or we would get a call from a professor saying, my grad student has been injured in a car accident, and we need some support for that. That is typically how we've done it. Over the last couple of years, we have realized, of course, that some of our folks are out in hazardous areas without eyes on supervision. They're working independently, they're researching independently. And so we have adopted a posture of being more proactive in looking for things that could affect us. So we look at a variety of international news sites and we scan those news sites against a list of countries where we're aware of activities. And then we create a bit of a situation report every day. That's been our typical approach in the past up until now.
Right, and of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room a little further when it comes to the pandemic. So, how did the security plans change? And I'm thinking back in the year 2020, which somehow seems like yesterday and eons ago at the same time. But when the pandemic first emerged, we had places like northern Italy undergoing just extreme caseloads and a public health disaster there long before, or at least somewhat before other parts of the world dealt with it. And of course, China dealt with this, around New Year's 2020, late 2019. So that news and the spread of the virus shifted over time and really didn't get to, Canada and North America in a very serious manner for a couple months after that. So, but like you mentioned, the University of Alberta is not just located in one place. So how did you manage these various facilities and institutions around the globe when one place might be undergoing lockdowns and another place might not even have had a single COVID-19 case in the region at the time?
The first task was to get good information. Some folks wanted to be able to get simple information, but as you said, sometimes the information couldn't be simple. The information had to be complicated. So we had to get good information. The second thing then was to make sure that we shared with literally everyone the institutional goals. That then allowed a lot of our supervisors and our leaders to come up with their own tactics to meet those goals. So we said, okay, everybody's going to work from home. There's been a provincial work from home order issued. And a number of supervisors handled that. They dealt with that on their own, which was amazing. The more complicated pieces, we created a response team. And that response team met daily at first. And then it created a series of subordinate specialist teams in academics, in student services, in general safety, in security, and tasks were farmed out to those groups. Those groups initially came back with lots of questions, and then gradually they fell into their own routine. That got us through all of the days where things didn't change. And it also gave us a good, strong net, a safety net that we could bring together and adapt to the changes that occurred. Some of them occurring very late at night, some of them occurring first thing in the morning, some of them predictable, some of them unpredictable. So the thing with COVID that was new was that it made everyone into an emergency responder. Parents, teachers, staff, students, everybody had to crisis manage. And that gave us a lot of people who we could tap to say, can you come in and join a larger team to assist with this?
That's a really interesting way of looking at this, and I think very pertinent too. It turned everyone into an emergency manager. I don't think I've thought of the pandemic in that manner, but when you think about it, regardless if you're managing a university with 40,000 plus students, or your own family, or your own small group of workers, you had to manage that emergency one way or another. So that must have been, just as it was for all of us, just an immense and unforgiving learning curve.
Yeah, and it has not stopped yet. As you said, hopefully we are moving out of this into a stage where its lethality is so reduced that we can take our foot off the gas. But there's a lot of lessons still to learn along the way, and people are tired. We had some folks early on, and everybody did. We had some folks early on who really struggled and who said, you know what, I can't do crisis management for anybody but myself. And they stepped back, which left the really resilient folks available to us. And so we gave those really resilient folks lots of things to do. Now, 2 years later, the resilient folks are starting to say, I can no longer do crisis management for anybody but myself. And there's nobody left. So that's still going to push us. And fingers crossed, spring sees us exit this pandemic finally and permanently. If it doesn't, we need to be really intentional about giving people rest, taking responsibility off their shoulders and letting them recover.
That reminds me of the crisis that's taking place in nursing right now across multiple countries. You say the folks who were really resilient, they were able to hang around, but you can only take that to a certain point. And now there's no one left. And I think from a security perspective, we look at hospitals, for instance, and they don't know how they're going to manage this huge nursing shortage. And from a security perspective, I think it's a very similar mechanism in that regard, Adam. And so I pose the question to you, how do you and your teammates manage that staffing situation?
I'm hesitating only because I'm not 100% sure yet. I think it goes back to the same. Start by getting really good information. So we said to our units, particularly our critical units, we said, if you are short on people, if you are starting to worry about whether you have enough people to operate your essential service, for heaven's sakes, phone us and tell us. Give us that information so that the organization can start to react. The other thing that we're ensuring is ready to go is our memorandums of understanding. It's very possible that COVID will exit the scene somewhat erratically, and that we'll have some areas recover very quickly and have capacity that they can lend to others. And some areas will continue to struggle and will need that capacity. So we're starting to look really wide at our friends and well-wishers to ensure that we can tap into their resources as needed.
Have you noticed any major vulnerabilities exposed by perhaps maybe because of the pandemic, directly or indirectly?
I can think of two right off the top of my head, and I reserve the right to go back and reconsider these.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, like you said, we've all been through a lot, so certainly, certainly, only two, I think, would be a bit of a victory, if you will. But curious to hear what you see as those vulnerabilities.
The first one is related to physical security. And so much of our physical security is dependent on passive surveillance. We depend on there being people in our buildings to not only detect security incidents, but also to enforce a certain norm of human behavior. I think about what we saw on the big transit systems when people who could stay home did, and people who were dependent on transit to get around continued to get around on transit. And the proportion of folks who were safe dropped, and that natural surveillance weakness became really clear there. We saw it on our campus, and some other institutions saw it on campus, where buildings that were empty were vulnerable to break and enter, and to, in fact, to inhabitation. So you would go to check a building that you thought was vacant and discover, in fact, that people were living in the building, because, of course, it tied in with a reduction in social services, a closure of daytime shelters. And those folks needed to be warm and safe somewhere. And they were quite aggressive at getting into some of our buildings, and we weren't there to detect them, refer them, prevent them from entering, check that doors had been closed properly, those kinds of things. The second vulnerability that this identified is the disproportionate burden of home management and childcare on typically female employees. And so that a you end up with a routine injustice, an injustice that we know about being exacerbated by the pandemic and coming back with really hard results and really difficult outcomes for an organization of our size to manage.
You wouldn't necessarily think of either of those elements as security risks, right? I mean, the traditional model of security risks is a guy trying to break in the building, or an active shooter in an extreme case, or weather as an example, right? Severe weather. But the examples you mentioned there, Adam, I find it really different angles to this security crisis that we're still dealing with. Because at the end of the day, even though you might not immediately associate what you just mentioned as being a security vulnerability, that does have an impact on your operations.
Yes, certainly the security risk from having your facilities vulnerable and porous and unsurveilled is a clearer jump. That that proportion of our people, the members of our community who are tasked officially with security, is so small that, and the responsibilities for security across the institution are so diffuse that you start to pull people out of those roles, and all of a sudden the system collapses quite quickly. For your workforce in general, the security concern from somebody who is well and happy and healthy and well supported and well connected socially is very small. And when you start to decrease those phenomena, you put them alone. You have somebody who loses those coworkers who were checking in on them every day to see how they were doing. You add in on them the financial pressures of working from home, the parenting pressures, then you start to end up with somebody who is a vulnerable person from a security perspective. And because we're all working from home, for a number of cases, of course, is we shipped home university computers, or we shipped home access to university systems. We had my cat drop by here and interrupt the podcast. If you take the cat out of that and you say, okay, now that's a housekeeper, or that's a babysitter who walks by a laptop and sees research information or financial information or credit card numbers, that can add to that as well.
Yeah, and again, a lot of these angles we're not thinking of it directly, but someone in your position has kind of been forced to consider all of these angles, and it really just goes to show how multifaceted the pandemic has been as a security challenge, for sure. I want to kind of follow up on that, Adam, by looking at some of the other risks. We are focusing, of course, on the pandemic and COVID-19 because that's been dominating our lives for the last couple of years. But I'm curious to hear a little more about some of the indirect threats, if you will. Now, a lot of people have been working from home over the last little while. I can only imagine what that's done in terms of cybersecurity and virtual threats like hacking. But explain a little bit more about whether or not that has been an increased concern, and what you're trying to do to deal with it.
So when I started at the University of Alberta, I said to our chief information security officer, I said, how many times do people try to hack us? And he said, in a second or in a minute. And then he laid out for me, given our campus population and the fact that most of our population are carrying at least 2 internet connected devices, and they're connecting over our Wi-Fi or our physical network, we have hundreds of thousands of doorways into our systems. Then we sent everybody home and we built more doorways into our systems. We have been very fortunate that we have an absolute crackerjack team of security, IT security people. We have been lucky to avoid major vulnerabilities. When we sent our people home to work, some of them took home university computers that we manage and we maintain the software on, and we have the ability to disconnect. Some people connected from personal devices, personal laptops, etc. We'd have, of course, no control over software that people are installing on their local laptops. And so while I connect to work, I may also be running software on the computer that is a security threat. And the bad guys know that I am working from home. And we may see an increase in phishing attempts, malware, etc., specifically targeting university administrators and university researchers. The bad actors know how valuable university data is. And we know that when they detect an institution that is vulnerable, they will step up their efforts to come at that group. And they will do it through work accounts, but they will also do it through personal accounts.
You talked about how often there are hacking attempts for the University of Alberta, and we're just looking at one university that is certainly not the largest in the world, and there are certainly many other institutions out there. I mean, you think of, the Oxfords and the Yales, and these places that have so many more campuses and students to deal with. So I can only imagine, Adam, if this is what the University of Alberta is going through, what is it like at these other institutions that may have different research areas or have even more vulnerable information?
They would be very tempting targets. We have not only the research data, but we have financial information. We have big vendors to whom we pay large amounts of money. Universities are attractive targets for cyber criminals, absolutely.
Adam, how much of a role is mental health playing when it comes to security plans? You talked a little bit about vulnerable people, and unfortunately, when you have vulnerable people and when you've been through a crisis like this, sometimes you can have serious mental health issues, and unfortunately, that can result in a security risk one way or another. But I'd be curious to know, how much is that factoring into the security plans or concerns you're dealing with nowadays?
Over the last 3 to 4 months, the worst case scenario from a severe mental health crisis has been one of our top 3 risks. And that is, in the last 3 or 4 months, because the COVID situation is changing so rapidly, folks who have less resilience or who are already struggling are given increasing amperage and increasing pressure as we exit, somewhat stumbling from COVID. We are therefore actively reaching out through our services that assist people to ensure that if they have anybody who is spiraling, or they have anybody that is causing them genuine, real concern for safety or for the safety of others, that we are sharing information between our helping agencies so that we can bring the resources to bear that that person needs. It is tiring. It is deeply uncomfortable, but it is so important to do, as the consequences of the worst case mental health crisis are so devastating and so permanently devastating for a community like ours.
And it's an unfortunate thing to say, Adam, but when someone is going through a mental health crisis, they could pose a risk to themselves and potentially to other people. And if, wherever it may be, if it's on campus or online or in whatever setting, if you see someone who is clearly in distress and may appear to be threatening without knowing the full context, regardless if it's a mental health issue or not, you have to deal first and foremost with that security angle, and then do whatever you can to try and get this person help. And that must just be an incredibly difficult situation to deal with, because we're trying to remember these are human beings, and people are not always going to act rationally, especially after dealing with 2 years of just punishing doom and gloom and a near constant stream of bad news. I mean, what a difficult situation to be placed in as a security professional.
Yes, there are many places that somebody who is angry and unsupported and generally agitated can go to get the worst kinds of support. And we have to be prepared at all times to be able to react to somebody who is generally angry and anxious and who has gotten really bad life advice from somebody or from a group of people. The safety and security of people in general and our population at large come first. And while we want to make sure that everybody's well taken care of, if we have to take an unpleasant action to stop a student or to stop a staff member or ask those tough questions or put into place those tough security measures, then we do that to keep everybody else safe.
We're focusing a lot on the abrupt changes brought on by the pandemic. But if we zoom out a little bit and let's try and move past COVID-19, what are some threats that you're monitoring that are present now, or perhaps what are some threats that you see emerging in the near future?
I think there are two in the near future, one of which is heavily security related, and the other one, which is more emergency management related. The security threat being the risk of global conflict, what people have called geopolitical tensions. That would involve governments around the world who are angry at our government and maybe taking action. The second one would be climate change. And from an emergency management perspective, that is the primary concern at all times in terms of its breadth, its scope, and its impact. But the other one, and this is really interesting, it's come out of some of the schools in the States that went back and looked at the Spanish flu, the previous 1918 pandemic that lasted 3 or 4 years, much like this one did. And they discovered that after the fact, much as we're discovering, not only was there that year, 12 months or so of mental health recovery and mental health stress, after that, there was an upsurge of new and exciting kinds of misbehavior that had not been experienced previously. And so if you look back at the Roaring Twenties, they were called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. And some of the medical researchers in the States have started to predict that the 2020s will see a similar increase in novel forms of misbehavior. And from a security perspective, that is going to require us to pay some attention to how folks are blowing off steam, recreating as we exit pandemic. And as the elastic band snaps back into being a social society again, and it anticipating and absorbing the effects of that, especially at a university where our population is so young.
What do you hear, Adam, from your counterparts across the country and around the world in terms of security concerns?
The fatigue is real. Everybody is tired. And that creates a reluctance or an inability to continue to adhere to security requirements, to continue monitoring. The rise in geopolitical tensions involving some very large nations and some very big economies is a global concern. And as we exit COVID in Canada, fingers crossed, there are some countries in the world who will continue to experience this, and that will create financial pressures, movement pressures, displaced people. And so that is causing a lot of concern globally as well. There's also this trend as people are permanently adopting working from home or blended models that cities may de-densify, or in some cases may also, to a limited extent, depopulate. that the city as a concept may be under some significant stress as well over the next little bit. And that will cause some challenges for our big universities that are located in city centers.
Overall, if you had to sum it up, when it comes to security, what keeps you up at night?
When it comes to security, what keeps me up at night primarily is data vulnerabilities and IT vulnerabilities. The amount of damage that a break and enter into your file system can do, I think could exceed the amount of damage that a break and enter into a physical facility could do. There was a malware attack on a Canadian university for which they paid a small ransom to free up their files, having no assurance that there was not further malware buried in the system that could resurge at some point. Adherence to development of enforcement of data security policies is so important right now. We're talking over the internet. We're dependent on about 18 different companies to manage our data every second. If one of those companies has a data outage, we lose this ability. And COVID, I think, showed us how dependent we are on those connectedness infrastructure pieces. And so that is what keeps me up at night.
Adam, we've covered a lot during our conversation here, and I think a lot of heavy topics as well. I always like to end these episodes with a little bit of, if you will, advice, because we have done a lot to identify problems. We've done a lot to identify some issues that you may not initially think about when it comes to security, right? Touching on mental health, for instance, and touching on the post-pandemic return to a social society, if you will. Again, factors I don't think a lot of people are thinking about right now. So considering your experience and your expertise that's kind of been generated over the last couple of years, what would be some of your advice to security professionals out there who are trying to navigate the post-pandemic turmoil?
I think the most important thing is good documentation. And that sounds so basic, but the better your documentation is, the faster you can learn and the faster you can implement your lessons learned. With the scope and number of crises that we're managing, that we're going to continue to manage, that 4-pillar cycle is going to run in parallel for dozens of events at the same time. And so we have to be reducing at the same time as we're responding and recovering and readying. And so taking how you operate and keeping it clear and keeping it simple and keeping it repeatable is really, really important for our discipline not to be crushed by the scope of its own work.
Adam, phenomenal insight. This has been a terrific discussion, very eye-opening, and really just gives a good overview of the sheer scope of the challenges facing the security world as we, again, hopefully, finally exit this pandemic. Really appreciate your time. If people listening to this or watching this want to find out more about you and the work you do at the University of Alberta, where can they go?
The best place to start is probably on our website. Have a look through our documentation that is there and our frameworks that are there. And if there's anything more that folks need, an email is always welcome.
Adam Conway is the Emergency Management Team Lead at the University of Alberta. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter at samdeskofficial. Adam will join us again in the next episode as we take a closer look at how he's handling security amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine.